The surrender unfolded not as a single moment, but as a slow collapse of certainty. It came after nights without sleep and days without direction, when orders had stopped arriving and the familiar rhythms of command dissolved into rumor and silence. The men gathered in uneven lines, uniforms stained with mud, smoke, and exhaustion, carrying the weight of defeat in their posture before it was ever spoken aloud. Around them, the land bore the unmistakable signature of a war that had stripped itself bare. Shattered buildings, scorched earth, abandoned equipment rusting in place like the bones of a larger, dying machine. In that stillness, surrender felt less like a choice and more like gravity finally asserting itself. For most of them, the act of laying down arms was inseparable from fear. Not fear of death in battle, which had long since become familiar, but fear of what followed defeat. Years of indoctrination and whispered stories had prepared them for a specific ending. They believed surrender meant punishment, and punishment meant suffering without limit. The enemy, as they had been taught, would arrive not with restraint but with fury, eager to settle scores accumulated through years of bloodshed. In their minds, mercy was a myth told to civilians, not a principle practiced by victors. As they waited, time stretched unnaturally. Each minute felt like a test of endurance, each sound, a distant engine, a boot on gravel, felt like the first signal of retribution. Some stared straight ahead, faces locked into expressions of rigid acceptance, as though emotional stillness might lessen what was coming. Others could not keep their eyes still, scanning the horizon for movement, for the first sign of judgment made manifest. No one spoke openly about fear, but it hung over the group like a low cloud, shared and understood without acknowledgement. Their expectations were shaped as much by memory as by propaganda. They remembered the brutality they themselves had witnessed and, in some cases, carried out. Villages reduced to ashes, prisoners marched away into uncertainty, civilians caught in the machinery of occupation. These memories fed the belief that war ended the way it was fought, without mercy, without pause. In that logic, surrender was not an act of survival, but an admission that one now stood at the mercy of an enemy who would show none. The irony was that surrender itself required courage of a different kind. To stop fighting meant to relinquish control over one's fate entirely. It meant trusting, however unwillingly, that the enemy would behave differently than expected. Yet trust was not what filled the air. What filled it was resignation. Many had already rehearsed their punishment internally, imagining interrogations, forced marches, camps defined by hunger and cruelty. The future, in their minds, was already written, and it was bleak. The landscape amplified these thoughts. The silence after battle was not peaceful, it was accusatory. Broken trees stood like witnesses, and craters scarred the ground where shells had torn through soil and flesh alike. Smoke lingered faintly, as if refusing to let the violence fully dissipate. Even the sky felt distant and indifferent, a vast expanse that offered no comfort or promise. In such a place, mercy seemed implausible, almost naive. Some men clutched personal items, photographs folded thin from repeated handling, letters kept dry through impossible circumstances. These small objects took on enormous significance in the waiting, as if they might anchor the self to something human before it was stripped away. Others had already begun to detach emotionally, preparing themselves for humiliation or pain by numbing anticipation. This psychological retreat was a survival instinct, a way to endure what they believed could not be avoided. The idea of punishment was not abstract. It had a shape and texture formed by stories passed along the front lines, by warnings from officers, by rumors amplified through fear. British captivity, they had been told, would be merciless. Tales spoke of harsh treatment, revenge disguised as discipline, and justice delivered without compassion. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the fact that they were believed. Belief alone was enough to shape expectation, and expectation shaped reality long before the first British soldier appeared. As hours passed, the waiting became heavier than any immediate blow could have been. The absence of action did not bring relief, it intensified uncertainty. Each man wondered when the moment would arrive, when the transition from defeated soldier to punished captive would be made explicit. The mind, deprived of information, filled the void with imagined cruelty. Fear fed on silence, growing more elaborate with each passing moment. There was also shame woven into the waiting. Surrender meant acknowledging failure, not just of strategy, but of purpose. Many had believed in the cause that sent them to war, or at least accepted it as inevitable. Now, standing unarmed, they were forced to confront the possibility that everything they had endured and inflicted might end not in triumph, but in condemnation. Punishment, in that sense, felt like the logical conclusion, a moral balancing of scales. Yet beneath fear and shame, there was a quieter, more fragile emotion, a desperate hope that the stories might be wrong. It was rarely spoken, even internally, because to hope was to risk disappointment. Still, it flickered in the background of thought, a small, dangerous spark. If mercy were possible, even in limited form, it would mean that the war's end did not have to mirror its worst moments. But hope was quickly suppressed, dismissed as weakness or illusion. The men adjusted their stance as they waited, shifting weight from foot to foot, stretching stiff muscles, wiping sweat and grime from their faces. These mundane movements emphasized their humanity in a situation that threatened to reduce them to symbols of defeat. Each man carried a personal history into that moment. Families left behind, choices made under pressure, actions justified by orders or survival. All of that now seemed suspended, awaiting judgment from an unseen authority. The psychological tension was compounded by the awareness that surrender was irreversible. There would be no return to the certainty of combat, no clarity of enemy and ally defined by gunfire. Instead, there was only the unknown, shaped entirely by how the victors chose to act. The power imbalance was absolute, and that realization stripped away any remaining illusions of control. In that suspended moment, before the arrival of British forces, the men lived inside their expectations. Punishment was not yet real, but it was already experienced in the imagination, rehearsed and accepted as destiny. The waiting itself became a form of suffering, a slow erosion of resolve driven by anticipation rather than action. What none of them could yet comprehend was that this waiting marked the final echo of the war they thought they understood. The assumptions they carried into surrender were about to be tested, not by violence, but by something far more destabilizing. At the threshold of defeat, before mercy or punishment had been revealed, they stood in a psychological no man's land, suspended between the world they knew and a future that would challenge everything they believed about enemies, victory, and the nature of power itself. The first sight of British forces did not confirm the fears that had been growing in the long hours of waiting. There was no sudden rush of violence, no shouted insults or raised weapons meant to intimidate. Instead, the approach was measured, almost procedural, as if this moment had been anticipated and rehearsed not for revenge but for control. Vehicles slowed as they neared the surrendered men, boots struck the ground with deliberate rhythm, and commands were issued in calm, regulated tones. This restraint, rather than offering immediate relief, produced a deeper unease. The absence of cruelty felt unnatural, as though it were merely a pause before something far worse. The men observed every movement with heightened awareness. A glance held too long, a gesture misunderstood, could, in their minds, trigger the punishment they expected. British soldiers positioned themselves efficiently, securing the area without excess force. Weapons were collected methodically, counted and set aside as tools rather than trophies. The act of disarmament, so often accompanied by humiliation in the stories they had heard, was handled with minimal ceremony. This quiet professionalism unsettled the prisoners more than overt hostility ever could. Orders were given, and the surrendered men were instructed where to stand, how to move, when to wait. The structure was immediate and unmistakable. Yet it lacked the sadism they had anticipated. There were no blows delivered for slowness, no arbitrary cruelty to assert dominance. The British presence communicated authority without theatrics, power without spectacle. For men conditioned to equate authority with brutality, this contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to process. The waiting continued, but it changed in character. Fear no longer centered solely on imminent violence, but on uncertainty about intention. The men searched faces for signs of hatred and found instead expressions of fatigue, focus, and routine. These soldiers, like themselves, bore the marks of prolonged war. Mud-streaked uniforms and weary eyes told a story of endurance rather than triumph. The realization that the enemy looked human, rather than monstrous, disrupted years of cultivated hostility. Processing began with efficiency. Names were recorded, units identified, ranks noted. This administrative attention carried an unexpected weight. To be documented was to be acknowledged as an individual rather than a faceless enemy. Yet this recognition did not immediately feel like respect. It felt like a prelude to judgment. Each question seemed to carry hidden consequences, and each answer was given cautiously, filtered through the fear of unseen repercussions. As time passed, it became clear that the British soldiers were operating within strict constraints. Their actions were governed by rules, enforced not only upon the prisoners but upon themselves. Discipline was evident in the way commands were followed, in the way tempers were kept in check. This adherence to order suggested that what was happening was not personal, not driven by revenge, but institutional. For the prisoners, this realization was both reassuring and unsettling. Institutional restraint offered protection, but it also meant that mercy was not arbitrary, it was deliberate. The contrast between expectation and reality grew sharper with each passing hour. Stories of immediate reprisals failed to materialize. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of processing, movement, and waiting. Food was not yet distributed, nor were comforts offered, but neither was suffering inflicted for its own sake. The British approach seemed designed to stabilize the situation rather than exploit vulnerability. This calm control denied the prisoners the emotional release of confirming their fears. The psychological strain intensified as a result. Without violence to justify hatred or despair, the men were left confronting the possibility that they had been wrong. This possibility was deeply uncomfortable. It threatened the narratives that had sustained them through years of war, narratives that painted the enemy as irredeemably cruel. If those narratives were false or exaggerated, what did that say about the choices they had made, the acts they had witnessed or committed? Small details took on disproportionate significance. A British soldier adjusted his helmet, another shared a brief word with a comrade that sounded almost casual. These moments of normalcy clashed violently with the prisoners' expectations. The enemy was not performing hatred, they were performing duty. This distinction, subtle yet profound, began to erode the moral clarity of us versus them thinking that war demands. The prisoners noticed that discipline was enforced impartially. British soldiers corrected one another when procedures were not followed precisely. This internal accountability was observed with surprise. It suggested a system that valued order over impulse, restraint over indulgence. For men who had lived under systems where orders could blur into cruelty, this was a revelation that carried unsettling implications. As the day progressed, exhaustion set in. Physical fatigue combined with emotional strain to dull the sharp edge of fear. Some men began to accept, tentatively, that immediate punishment was not coming. This acceptance did not bring peace, it brought confusion. What was expected of them now? How were they to interpret this treatment? Without clear answers, their minds oscillated between relief and suspicion. The British presence remained steady and unprovocative. There were no speeches, no declarations of victory, no attempts to humiliate. Victory, in this context, was expressed through control and order rather than dominance. This form of power was unfamiliar to the prisoners, who had been conditioned to see power as something loudly asserted. The quiet authority they now faced was more difficult to resist or resent. As evening approached, the prisoners were moved in organized groups to temporary holding areas. The movement was conducted without unnecessary force, guided by clear instructions and enforced with consistency rather than aggression. The act of being moved, of entering captivity proper, carried symbolic weight. It marked a transition from battlefield defeat to structured confinement. Yet even here, the anticipated cruelty failed to appear. The men began to exchange glances, brief and uncertain. Without words, they communicated shared confusion. The war had taught them to read danger in tone and gesture, but the signals before them did not align with their training. The enemy's restraint created a vacuum where certainty had once been. Into that vacuum crept questions they were not prepared to answer. As darkness settled, the psychological impact of the day became clearer. The absence of punishment did not mean safety, but it did mean that the future was no longer predetermined by fear alone. The men lay awake, minds racing, replaying the day's events in search of hidden threats or delayed consequences. Yet the memory that persisted was not one of violence, but of order. In this phase of captivity, the shock was not in what happened, but in what did not. No vengeance had been exacted, no rage unleashed. The British conduct introduced a new and destabilizing reality, that surrender did not automatically lead to degradation. This realization did not bring immediate comfort. Instead, it began a slow, internal unraveling of assumptions that had once felt unshakable. The men had expected punishment as a certainty, a final act of the war's cruelty. Instead, they encountered restraint that demanded a different kind of reckoning. In the quiet, controlled aftermath of surrender, they found themselves facing not the brutality they had prepared for, but the far more disorienting challenge of an enemy who refused to behave as expected. The next phase of captivity unfolded gradually, marked not by dramatic declarations but by a series of small, undeniable actions that reshaped the emotional landscape of the surrendered men. The shock of restraint had already unsettled them, but what followed pressed even deeper, challenging assumptions that had once felt as solid as fact. It began with attention to the wounded. Those who had been limping, bleeding, or barely standing were identified and separated, not for punishment or interrogation, but for treatment. This distinction mattered. In the logic of total war, weakness often invited cruelty. Here, weakness drew care. Medical personnel moved among the prisoners with professional detachment, their focus fixed on injuries rather than uniforms or allegiances. Bandages were applied, wounds cleaned, pain assessed with clinical precision. The touch of hands trained to heal rather than harm carried a symbolic weight that exceeded the physical relief it provided. For men who had braced themselves for neglect or deliberate suffering, this care landed like an emotional rupture. It did not erase fear, but it fractured it, introducing doubt where certainty had once ruled. Water followed, distributed with the same unremarkable efficiency. Canteens were passed along lines, cups refilled without comment. Thirst, which had been endured as part of battle, now met an unexpected response. The simple act of hydration became a moment of confrontation with reality. The enemy was not denying them basic dignity. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense, it was policy. That distinction made it harder to dismiss as an exception or an act of individual compassion. Mercy, in this form, appeared systematic. The men struggled to reconcile these actions with everything they had been taught. Propaganda had painted the enemy as vengeful, eager to humiliate and destroy. Yet here were gestures that suggested restraint was not weakness but principle. The cognitive dissonance intensified. If the enemy was capable of mercy, then the moral framework that justified hatred began to collapse. This collapse was not immediate or total, but it was irreversible. Once a crack appeared, it spread. As hours turned into days, routines emerged. Prisoners were organized into groups, schedules established, expectations communicated clearly. The predictability of this structure carried its own emotional consequences. Predictability reduced fear, but it also removed the psychological shield of constant threat. Without imminent danger, the men were left alone with memory and thought. The noise of survival quieted, allowing reflection to intrude. Conversations among the prisoners, when they occurred, were tentative and subdued. There was an unspoken agreement not to express relief too openly, as if doing so might invite correction from fate. Instead, observations were shared cautiously. A wounded man had been treated promptly. No one had been struck for speaking out of turn. Food, though basic, had arrived on schedule. These facts accumulated, forming a pattern that could not be ignored. The British guards remained distant but attentive. They enforced rules consistently, intervening when necessary but avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Their demeanor suggested a clear separation between duty and emotion. This separation, so different from the caricature of a cruel victor, forced the prisoners into an uncomfortable reassessment. Hatred relies on simplification. What they were encountering resisted simplification at every turn. For many, the realization that mercy was being extended triggered a delayed emotional response. Fear gave way to confusion, confusion to introspection. The absence of cruelty denied them the comfort of victimhood. They could not easily frame themselves as martyrs to enemy brutality. Instead, they were confronted with the possibility that the war's moral lines were far less clear than they had believed. This internal reckoning was deeply personal. Each man carried his own history into captivity, choices made under orders, moments of hesitation or compliance, acts remembered with pride or regret. Mercy did not absolve these memories, it illuminated them. In the quiet of confinement, without the distraction of immediate danger, memories resurfaced with new intensity. Acts once justified as necessary now appeared in a different light when contrasted with the restraint being shown by their captors. The idea that mercy could be strategic rather than emotional was particularly unsettling. It suggested a form of strength that did not rely on domination. The British conduct implied confidence, an assurance that control did not require cruelty. For men raised in systems that equated authority with fear, this model of power felt destabilizing. It challenged not only their view of the enemy but their understanding of leadership and obedience. Some prisoners responded defensively, clinging more tightly to old narratives. They dismissed the treatment as temporary, a facade meant to soften them before harsher measures began. This belief offered psychological protection against disappointment. Yet as days passed and restraint continued, such explanations grew harder to maintain. The consistency of mercy undermined the idea that it was a calculated deception. Others began to experience a quiet, unsettling admiration. This was rarely spoken aloud, even internally, because it carried a sense of betrayal of comrades lost, of ideals upheld, of years spent believing in a different moral universe. Admiration for the enemy threatened to destabilize identity itself. To acknowledge it was to admit that one's own side did not hold a monopoly on honor or humanity. The camp environment, though austere, reinforced these impressions. Rules were enforced, but not arbitrarily. Infractions were addressed proportionally, without spectacle. This fairness, limited as it was, carried profound psychological implications. It suggested that even in captivity, there were boundaries that would not be crossed. Boundaries, once established, create space for thought. Within that space, reflection deepened. The prisoners began to notice the contrast between how they were treated and how they had expected to be treated. This contrast became a constant presence, shaping every interaction. It followed them into sleep, where dreams blended fear with confusion. It surfaced in waking moments, when a guard's neutral expression carried more weight than a shouted insult ever could. Neutrality, in this context, was revolutionary. Mercy also altered the emotional hierarchy among the prisoners themselves. Those who had expected to endure punishment with stoic resolve found their identity challenged. Endurance was no longer the primary virtue. Instead, adaptability and honesty with oneself became necessary for psychological survival. Some struggled with this transition, feeling unmoored without the familiar structure of suffering. The shock, then, was cumulative rather than immediate. It did not arrive as a single revelation but as a series of small, undeniable moments that collectively dismantled expectation. Each act of restraint added to the weight of evidence. Each day without punishment deepened the sense that something fundamental was shifting. In this environment, mercy functioned as a mirror. It reflected back not only the enemy's values but the prisoner's own actions and beliefs. This reflection was uncomfortable, even painful. It forced questions that had long been suppressed by the urgency of war. What had been done in the name of duty? What had been accepted without question? What might have been different under other circumstances? The men did not arrive at answers quickly, nor did they arrive together. Each internal journey unfolded at its own pace, shaped by personality, memory, and conscience. What united them was the recognition that mercy had disrupted the narrative of inevitable cruelty. The war they thought they understood was revealing a final, unexpected dimension. By confronting them with humanity rather than hatred, the British conduct achieved something punishment never could. It destabilized certainty. It introduced doubt not as weakness, but as an opening. In that opening, the men found themselves grappling with the possibility that the enemy was not defined solely by opposition, and that the war's end might demand not only physical surrender, but a moral reckoning that would linger long after captivity began. Days passed, and with them came a subtle but profound transformation in the nature of captivity. What had initially felt temporary and uncertain began to solidify into a structured reality. The men woke at set times, moved when instructed, ate when food was distributed, and rested within defined boundaries. This predictability did not erase the fact of defeat, but it reframed it. Captivity was no longer a limbo filled only with fear of what might come next. It became an environment governed by rules that were consistently applied. That consistency mattered more than the men initially realized. The routines imposed by the British forces were strict, but they were also transparent. Expectations were communicated clearly, and consequences for violations were measured rather than arbitrary. This absence of randomness marked a stark contrast to what many prisoners had anticipated. In their experience of war, power often manifested as unpredictability, violence delivered without warning to reinforce dominance. Here, power expressed itself through order. The predictability removed one layer of terror, but it also stripped away excuses. Without chaos to blame, the men were left confronting their circumstances with clearer minds. As the days stretched on, the realization settled in that this restraint was not accidental or situational. It was systematic. Guards rotated shifts, followed procedures, and corrected one another when lines were crossed. The prisoners noticed this internal discipline with growing awareness. It suggested that mercy was not dependent on individual temperament but embedded in a larger framework of conduct. This observation carried unsettling implications. If restraint could be institutionalized, then cruelty, too, was a choice rather than an inevitability. The camp environment reinforced this lesson in subtle ways. Physical conditions were harsh but not deliberately degrading. Space was limited, privacy non-existent, and comfort minimal. Yet there was a clear boundary between hardship and humiliation. The men were not stripped of identity beyond what captivity required. They remained individuals within a system, not objects to be broken. This distinction, thin as it was, carried immense psychological weight. With immediate survival concerns stabilized, attention turned inward. The mind, deprived of constant threat, began to revisit memories that had been suppressed by the urgency of combat. Scenes from the war resurfaced uninvited, moments of fear, moments of obedience, moments of moral compromise. In battle, reflection had been a luxury few could afford. In captivity, it became unavoidable. The quiet enforced by routine created space for thought, and thought, once unleashed, proved difficult to contain. The men began to recognize that the absence of cruelty was itself a form of confrontation. British restraint did not shout accusations, but it posed questions nonetheless. What did it mean to have expected brutality and instead receive order? What did it say about the systems they had served, the behaviors they had normalized? These questions did not demand immediate answers, but they lingered, shaping perception in subtle, persistent ways. Some prisoners responded by retreating further into themselves. They clung to familiar narratives, framing the enemy's behavior as strategic rather than sincere. This interpretation offered emotional insulation. If mercy was merely a tactic, then it carried no moral challenge. Yet as days became weeks, the consistency of restraint eroded this defense. Tactics change, principles endure. The British conduct showed little variation, even when it would have been easy to act otherwise. Others found themselves unsettled by a different realization, that mercy could coexist with authority without undermining it. The guards did not lose control by refraining from cruelty. If anything, control seemed strengthened by restraint. Compliance was achieved not through terror but through clarity and consequence. This observation contradicted deeply ingrained beliefs about power and obedience. 4 men raised to equate discipline with fear. This model demanded reconsideration. The psychological impact extended beyond individual reflection to the collective atmosphere of the camp. Tension among prisoners shifted in tone. Without constant external threat, internal hierarchies and conflicts surfaced. Yet even these tensions were tempered by the structured environment. Disputes were addressed, rules enforced, and escalation prevented. The presence of consistent oversight limited the descent into chaos that often accompanies confinement. In this controlled space, the men began to see one another differently. Comrades once united solely by shared danger now revealed differences in character, belief, and response to captivity. Some adapted quickly, finding a measure of stability in routine. Others struggled, haunted by guilt or anger that had nowhere to discharge. Mercy did not heal these internal wounds, it exposed them. The concept of punishment, once anticipated as physical suffering, transformed into something more abstract and enduring. The real burden became moral rather than bodily. Without violence to rally against, the men were forced to sit with their thoughts. They replayed decisions, questioned justifications, and confronted contradictions they had long ignored. This introspection was not imposed by guards or interrogators. It emerged organically from the environment of restraint. The British guards, for their part, maintained distance. They did not seek to provoke reflection or extract confessions. Their role remained administrative, focused on order and security. Yet this very detachment amplified the psychological effect. There was no overt moralizing, no lectures on right and wrong. The absence of accusation made the internal reckoning feel self-generated and therefore unavoidable. Over time, the men began to understand that restraint was not the absence of judgment, but a different form of it. By refusing to dehumanize their captives, the British implicitly affirmed a standard of conduct that transcended victory. This affirmation, silent yet persistent, stood in contrast to the totalizing logic of war that had governed the prisoners' lives. It suggested that even amid conflict, boundaries mattered. This realization unsettled long-held assumptions. War had taught them that necessity justified excess, that survival excused brutality. Yet here was an opposing example, victory secured without abandoning restraint. The implication was uncomfortable. If restraint was possible here, had it been possible elsewhere? Had different choices been available, even under pressure? These questions did not lead to immediate condemnation, but they eroded certainty. As the days accumulated, the shock of mercy evolved into a deeper unease. The men were no longer merely surprised by their treatment, they were changed by it. The enemy they had imagined as cruel and vindictive had revealed a different face, one that complicated simple narratives of good and evil. This complexity demanded a response, even if that response remained unspoken. The camp became a space where time slowed, and with it, the mind wandered. The future remained uncertain, but the present was defined by restraint rather than terror. In this environment, the men began to sense that punishment, as they had conceived it, might never come. Instead, they faced a different consequence: the enduring discomfort of having their assumptions dismantled. This phase of captivity marked a turning point. The war was no longer an external event fought with weapons and orders. It had moved inward, becoming a struggle of interpretation and memory. The British mercy, consistent and unspectacular, functioned as a quiet force, reshaping understanding without coercion. By choosing order over vengeance, restraint over cruelty, the victors had altered the terms of defeat. The men were no longer simply defeated soldiers awaiting punishment. They were individuals confronting the unsettling realization that the moral landscape of the war was more complex than they had been led to believe. In that realization lay a shock deeper than any physical reprisal, a recognition that the war's final battle was not fought on the battlefield, but within the conscience of those who survived it. As captivity settled into a prolonged state rather than a temporary condition, its psychological weight deepened in ways the men had not anticipated. What they had once feared as physical punishment slowly revealed itself as something more enduring and more intimate. The routines that had initially brought stability now created long stretches of mental stillness, and in that stillness, unresolved thoughts gained strength. Mercy, which had first appeared as an anomaly, became a constant presence, and its persistence transformed it from relief into pressure. Without brutality to rally against, the men were denied a familiar psychological refuge. Suffering inflicted by an enemy can be externalized. It offers a clear target for anger and blame. The absence of such suffering left them with no obvious outlet. Resentment, when it arose, had nowhere to attach itself convincingly. The guards were distant but fair, the rules strict but predictable. This neutrality dismantled the emotional scaffolding that many had relied on to endure defeat. Gradually, attention turned inward with increasing intensity. Memories resurfaced not as fragments but as sequences, replayed with an uncomfortable clarity. Decisions once justified as necessary now appeared stripped of context, exposed to moral scrutiny. Moments that had been dismissed as routine or unavoidable began to feel heavier. Mercy did not accuse, but it illuminated. In that light, the men found themselves re-examining not only what they had done, but what they had accepted without resistance. The idea of responsibility became inescapable. In war, responsibility is often diffused, shared among commanders, systems, and circumstances. Captivity, by contrast, isolated the individual. Alone with thought, each man confronted his own role in a vast machinery of violence. British restraint removed the distraction of victimhood, making it harder to deflect blame outward. This shift was deeply unsettling. It challenged the notion that moral weight could be entirely displaced onto orders or necessity. Conversations among prisoners reflected this change, though rarely in direct terms. Discussions drifted toward memory and speculation, often framed as questions rather than statements. What would happen next? How long would captivity last? Beneath these surface concerns lay deeper, unspoken inquiries. How would this war be remembered? What would it mean to return home after defeat? How would one explain not only loss, but participation? For some, the mercy they experienced intensified feelings of guilt. They had prepared themselves to endure punishment as a form of atonement. Pain in their minds would balance the scales. Its absence felt like a denial of closure. Without visible suffering, there was no clear endpoint, no moment that marked the settling of accounts. The war lingered unresolved, echoing in thought rather than flesh. Others experienced a different response, a growing sense of moral dislocation. If the enemy could exercise restraint, what did that say about the inevitability of cruelty? Had brutality been as necessary as they had believed, or had it been normalized through repetition and justification? These questions did not arrive with clarity. They emerged slowly, often resisted, but they did not disappear. Mercy had created space for doubt, and doubt proved persistent. The British Guards, by maintaining their distance, inadvertently amplified this internal struggle. There were no confrontations that might have allowed prisoners to project anger outward. No insults to provoke defensive pride. The neutrality of their conduct left the prisoners alone with themselves. This isolation was not physical but psychological, and it proved far more challenging than confinement. Time passed unevenly. Days blended together, marked by routine rather than event. In this monotony, the mind sought stimulation, often turning back to the past. Memories of comrades lost resurfaced, accompanied by questions that had once been suppressed by urgency. Had those losses been inevitable? Had they served a purpose that still held meaning? Mercy did not answer these questions, but it made them unavoidable. The absence of vengeance also altered how the men perceived victory and defeat. Victory, as they had understood it, was inseparable from domination. Defeat from humiliation. Yet here they were, defeated but not degraded. This contradiction unsettled the symbolic order that had governed their understanding of war. If defeat did not require cruelty, then perhaps victory did not require brutality either. This realization destabilized long-held beliefs about power. Some prisoners began to recognize that mercy functioned as a form of moral endurance. It required discipline, restraint, and confidence. The British forces, in choosing this path, demonstrated a strength that did not rely on fear. This interpretation was difficult to accept, as it implied admiration for the enemy. Admiration, even reluctant, threatened loyalty to one's own side and to the sacrifices that had been made. The men grappled with this tension privately. To acknowledge the enemy's restraint felt like betrayal, not of a nation, but of memory. It complicated grief. It blurred the lines that had once made loss comprehensible. War demands clarity to sustain itself. Mercy dissolved that clarity, replacing it with ambiguity that lingered long after the guns had fallen silent. As weeks passed, the psychological hierarchy of suffering shifted. Physical hardship remained, but it no longer defined the experience. Instead, the dominant struggle became interpretive. How should this treatment be understood? Was it an exception, a strategy, or a principle? Each interpretation carried different implications for how the war would be remembered and how the self would be judged. The men found that they could not return to their earlier expectations. The idea of inevitable punishment had been replaced by a more complex reality. Mercy, once shocking, had become a constant, and with it came the responsibility to make sense of it. This responsibility weighed heavily, particularly on those who had relied on a narrative of enemy cruelty to justify their own actions. In quiet moments, some men imagined telling their stories after the war. They realized that the absence of cruelty would complicate those narratives. There would be no simple tale of suffering at the hands of a brutal victor. Instead, there would be an uncomfortable honesty about restraint received where brutality had been expected. This honesty demanded introspection, and introspection demanded courage of a different kind. The camp environment, unchanged in its routines, continued to exert pressure through its very stability. Nothing dramatic happened to interrupt thought. No crisis arrived to redirect attention outward. This constancy made the internal struggle inescapable. Mercy, by persisting, became a force that reshaped memory even as events unfolded. Gradually, the men understood that what they were experiencing was not leniency, but a refusal to perpetuate the war's logic beyond its end. The British conduct suggested that conflict could be concluded without extending violence into peace. This suggestion carried profound implications. It reframed the war not as a totalizing moral collapse, but as a human failure that could still be bounded by choice. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought responsibility. If restraint had been possible here, then responsibility for brutality elsewhere could no longer be dismissed as inevitability. Mercy forced a confrontation with agency, one's own and that of others. It demanded acknowledgement that choices had existed, even under pressure. By denying the men the punishment they had expected, mercy imposed a subtler burden. It required them to live with unresolved questions, with memory unsoftened by vengeance. The shock was not in surviving captivity, but in surviving with conscience intact and active. In this stage of their experience, the war's violence receded into the past, but its moral consequences moved closer. The men were no longer bracing for physical harm. They were confronting something more enduring, the realization that the end of the war did not end accountability, and that mercy, far from absolving them, had stripped away the final refuge of simple narratives.